Good evening and welcome to the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College. My name is Ben Hool and I'm a senior politics major here. Tonight it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. John McConnell. John attended Carleton College for his undergraduate degree and then went on to get his law degree from Yale. John served all 8 years of the Bush-Cheney administration, holding a unique position of both deputy assistant to the president and assistant to the vice president. During his tenure with the Bush-Cheney administration, he was also part of the three-person team responsible for all the president's major addresses, including the speech to the joint session of Congress after September 11, 2001, and 4 State of the Union addresses. He co-authored eulogies by President Bush and Vice President Cheney for President Ronald Reagan, remarks following the loss of the Space Shuttle Columbia, and the President's remarks on September 14, 2001 at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. John has since then served as a resident fellow at Harvard University's Institute of Politics at the John F. Kennedy School of Government in the spring of 2011. He also serves as chairman of the selection committee for the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize, recognizing distinguished reporting in the presidency. And he is now a Washington-based consultant in the field of politics and government. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Mr. John McConnell.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you all very much, and please forgive my slight allergy this evening. Nothing can be done about it, but I'm sorry. Neil Levesque just reminded me that all of my comments here tonight will be filmed and recorded, so if I say anything embarrassing, he said, you're done for. But it's great to be here. It's great to be a guest of the IOP. It truly is. I've been looking forward to coming up here. As I told some of my hosts earlier, I was here in 1992 with Vice President Dan Quayle when he came through town on a surrogate mission to help President Bush beat Pat Buchanan in the New Hampshire primary of 1992. Mission accomplished. They did beat Buchanan, but it was one of the few victories they enjoyed that year. But it is great to be back here and to see the place and to see what a wonderful facility this Institute of Politics has become. Neil showed me around, and we looked at all these pictures around the room here tonight, and it really is the case that the history that's been made in the state of New Hampshire is unequaled in this country when you think about in terms of presidential politics, and I'm sure it will ever be thus. But I grew up being interested in politics always, and one of the first political concepts I became familiar with was the New Hampshire primary and how important it was. And I remember when Ronald Reagan lost that primary in 1976 when I was a little boy and wondering what the future held for him. Well, it didn't hold much for him in 1976, but there was greatness in the future. But when you're infected with the political bug at an early age, it's usually terminal. It stays with you, and that's been the case for me. I guess I thought as a kid that I would run for office, that I would go and get my legal degree, and then I would go and practice law and go back to the community I came from, and then eventually run for office and be a politician. As it turned out, I got involved in politics at a very interesting level, but behind the scenes. I have gotten to meet a lot of people who've had positions similar to mine in the government. One of them is Pat Buchanan, who I mentioned a second ago. He was a speechwriter to President Nixon in the 60s and 70s. And he tells a story about Nixon being frustrated once about the material he was getting. And he said, "Why can't I get speechwriters like Woodrow Wilson had?" And Pat Buchanan reminded him, "Mr. President, Wilson wrote his own speeches." But every president since Wilson has had speechwriters, starting with Warren Harding in the early 1920s and Calvin Coolidge. I believe that both Harding and Coolidge had the same speechwriter, a fellow by the name of Judson Welliver. And his title was literary clerk, but he was a speechwriter for the president. And there is, to this very day, a club of former White House speechwriters called the Judson Welliver Society that meets every so often in Washington, D.C., every year and a half or so. The last dinner was at Chris Matthews' house, and because he was a speechwriter for President Carter. And at the last dinner, we had speechwriters for the last 13 presidents, including 2 speechwriters for Harry Truman. Truman had 3 speechwriters, 2 of whom are still living, and one of whom just passed away this past year. But it's a great group of people who have had the opportunity to share similar experiences, but for very different presidents. My president, of course, was George W. Bush, who I went to work for in the year 2000 when he was the governor of Texas, and really getting heavily into his presidential campaign. I had been working in Phoenix for former Vice President Quayle, who had been my boss at the White House, and who I worked with for a number of years after he left office. And when the opportunity came to go to Austin to work for George W., Vice President Quayle was one of those people who really strongly encouraged me to do it, saying, I really think this guy is going to be elected president this year, and you need to go down there and be part of a winning presidential campaign. You'll count it among the great experiences of your life. So I did. I went down there. There were already 2 writers on the staff, Michael Gerson and Matthew Scully, both very accomplished writers, and both writers that I had worked with in the Dole campaign in '96. And in the case of Matthew Scully, we had worked together in the Quayle office as well. It was a pretty straightforward kind of assignment. I always say that when you're a speechwriter, you have the most self-descriptive title a job can have. What do you do? Well, guess. It's not like a lot of titles in Washington. You're the Under-Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Procurement. Okay, well, now tell me what your job is. Whereas speechwriting, very straightforward. So we worked together, the 3 of us, initially dividing up the work. We would, the governor had X number of events on his schedule, and we would just divide that number by 3 and allot the speeches to the respective writers. And then when a draft was ready, the 3 of us would gather together in Mike's office, and we would edit the speech, just get it up on the computer screen and go through it line by line. In a fairly short period after I started, we began writing this way. That is, starting with a blank computer screen, 3 guys sitting around a desk, 1 computer, 1 keyboard, and really writing a whole speech that way. And as it turned out, we wrote that way in Austin, and then for the entire first term of President Bush, we had the same practice. That is, meeting in one office, usually mine, and writing as a team. Most writers, when you describe this to them, don't like the idea. They're horrified at the idea of being in a room with other people, much less collaborating when they're the writer. They prefer to do it alone. Writers prefer to be left alone and not interrupted, and preferably, of course, not edited. But if you're a speechwriter, you're going to get used to being edited. And in the case of my colleagues and me, we just found that it was a very good way of getting a good work product. We've all had the experience of writing, especially those of you who've been through college, of writing a paper. Sometimes you waste 2 hours. You think you had a good idea, and you realize you had a bad idea, and it really didn't go anywhere. You've just wasted 2 hours of my life. Well, it really doesn't happen that way when you have 2 other writers in the room. And so we found that really it was an efficient way of getting good work done. And because we had an odd number, you never had a deadlock in terms of voting on whether something was going to be included in a speech or not, I guess. Mike Gerson, of course, was the boss. He was the chief speechwriter, and so he could resolve any serious professional disagreements, but I'm happy to say there were very few of those. Now, one of the first things we learned when we came to Washington, now this would be around Christmas time of 2000, after the Supreme Court had finally resolved the Bush versus Gore litigation, and our boss was now the president-elect. We were sent to Washington to the Presidential Transition Office, and we learned that there was going to be quite a different process now for the speechwriting office. It used to be that in the campaign we would finish a speech draft, show it to a couple of the senior people, and then Karen Hughes or somebody would give it directly to Governor Bush. Now we learned that it wasn't going to work that way. We learned about the person called the staff secretary. Now it's kind of a prosaic sounding title, but the staff secretary is actually one of the most important people in the government of the United States. The staff secretary is the person who controls the flow of paper to and from the president's desk, so that a perfect detailed record is made of everything that a president sees and writes on, edits, or what have you. It's a system, as I understand it, that was put in place by President Eisenhower. Imagine a five-star general becoming president and imposing a very strict system on the White House. Actually was very good, and what it does is, as I say, it just facilitates very good record keeping and very good organization. The President of the United States in the modern age gives 500 speeches a year, roughly. Just a huge amount of speeches, more than in any campaign. It's just 1 to 3 sets of prepared remarks just about every day. The staff secretary helps keep that overwhelming number of documents and pieces of paper kept in an orderly way. So when the speechwriters finish a draft, the draft then goes to the staff secretary, and the staff secretary circulates to the senior people in the White House, starting with the vice president, the chief of staff, and then the department heads. And there'll just be a piece of paper on the front that says, this is from the staff secretary. These are draft remarks for the president for next Thursday at the Veterans of Foreign Wars National Convention. Comments due in the speechwriting office by 5 o'clock today. Well, that is the cue for the department heads and senior people who receive this document. Well, now they've got to go over this presidential speech, and they've got to send in their suggested changes and their comments. Now, this is especially important for the person whose policy area the speech deals with. They've really got to get back to you because you want to make sure that the document is consistent with the president's prior statements on these issues and is in a consistent voice and things of that nature. The writers are not experts. I certainly did not come to the White House as an expert in anything, or not an expert in anything relevant. And so you really do depend on a very good staffing process to go through and to make sure that what you've done is of the right quality policy-wise. You are the writer, though, so you don't have to take all of the comments that are made if they're just just preferences of style. So if someone just wants to propose another way of wording something, if I'm responsible for this speech, I don't have to accept this, even if this person is senior to me on the staff, unless it's really good. Then of course I'll take it. But a substantive suggestion, of course, is another matter. Of course, it's not as if Dr. Rice would say, well, there's a paragraph on page 3 of the speech about Russia policy, and it's wrong. I can't say, well, she has her opinion and I have my opinion, and I'm the speechwriter, and we'll do it my way. Of course, you always defer on matters of substance, and the result is, added to a fact-checking operation in the speechwriting office, the result is that the president, when he receives the speech, doesn't have to go, who looked at this? Has this been circulated? Are these facts accurate? Are these statements consistent with prior policies? He doesn't have to worry too much about that because the process ensures that these questions have been answered in a satisfactory fashion. But now the president has the speech. Well, if you work for George W. Bush, you learn very soon that the president has certain ways he likes to have his speeches prepared. He's demanding as an editor. He wants a logical flow in a speech, a nice, clean, compelling, logical flow. Sometimes if there was someone who really insisted that something be dropped into a speech, it might not really fit, but it feels important. Really, this really should go in the speech. The president would refer to those as cram-ins. He would usually recognize them with surgical precision and be able to pull them out of the speech. And usually he could tell you who had suggested it. He got very good at that. He marked his speeches up with a Sharpie. We all know the Sharpie, the big black pen with the heavy ink that kind of bleeds through the page. And so when you get a speech draft, very often it would be covered with very thick black marks. But was always an improvement when the president would go through. He made very smart edits, when we would turn another draft and get it back to him, there would come a time when he would read through the speech. And if it was a major speech, the speechwriters would be with him in the Oval Office. And he would just sit back in his chair and read it aloud. And in those times, we would often get some of our very best edits from the president, because he would start to think aloud while he was reading something, and then he would say, well, how about if we add this? I remember once in the State of the Union message, it was either 2002 or 2003, the president wasn't really happy with the conclusion that we had written, and we made a couple of goes at it, and he still really wasn't happy with it. And he said, what I want to say is that the liberty we prize is not America's gift to the world. It's Almighty God's gift to all humanity. I want to say something like that. And we said, how about just say that? And he said, well, put it down and we'll see how it looks. Well, of course, it became one of the signature lines of his presidency, and it came directly from him. So these were very useful sessions. If it was a speech to Congress or an address to the nation, he would usually use the teleprompter. And I guess I don't have to describe to anyone here what a teleprompter is. It's the glass shields we've all seen with the moving words bouncing off a screen on the floor. It's a tool that you need to practice, and so the president, whoever is president, will go into a little movie theater in the east wing of the White House, and it's just set up there, a narrow movie theater, but a movie theater in very recognizable sense. And they would set up the lectern and the teleprompter, and he would practice it. And if you were involved in writing the speech, you would come to the practice, and he would do his read through there. And sometimes the dog would come in and participate by nibbling on his pants leg or something. And then he would bond further with the document and make more changes. And if he wanted to do, and very often in these sessions, he would stay with us and say, let's work through this line together. He wouldn't just say, fix that and leave the room. Very often he would stay with us and really work things through. I have been asked many times what was the greatest single thing about my job, and it's easy to say the greatest thing about my job is that I worked for someone I liked. And as I say, I've met speechwriters to a lot of presidents, and they did not all like the president they worked for. They didn't. Most did, but I've heard from others from some that they didn't. I cannot imagine it. But that's because mainly I didn't have that problem. I worked for someone I liked very much, a successor of Washington and Lincoln and Roosevelt and Reagan, and it's a pretty high bar to clear, but I never thought the less of him for it. I always felt he was worthy of his position, publicly and privately. And when you write for a president, you have an important job, but you can only do so much. Even your best work is not going to supply the president's strength. It's not going to supply him believability, and it's not going to supply him character. Those are the things that the president has or doesn't have. President Bush is very demanding, as I mentioned, but he's an open, warm, expansive person. He's been to New Hampshire many times. You know that here. Calls everybody by their name. I've never seen a person in politics so attuned to the individuals around him. And he was very, very good with names, just astonishingly good with names. He was considerate. I never saw the president on a weekend without him saying at least once, hey, thanks for coming in on a weekend. I mean, imagine, as if he wouldn't do it, working on the White House staff, but he did not take that kind of thing for granted in terms of how he viewed himself. He always thought it was a good thing, and he would say so. I felt he was easy to read. I was mentioning to a group of students that I had dinner with a little bit earlier that if I had never met President Bush, I would feel like I could read his personality, because he's not the type to hide his feelings. His expressions show what he is thinking, whether he's happy or sad or bored or irritated or angry. You pretty much get a good sense of that by just looking at the man. So I liked working around someone who was easy to read. As Ben mentioned, I also wrote through this entire time for Dick Cheney, who is a wonderful guy, very different personality from George W. Bush. But no one has been so nice to me in my career as Vice President Cheney. He has a very fine speaking voice, but deep voice. And he didn't give nearly as many speeches as the president, but he gave a number of important speeches during his time in office. One day, my phone rang, and you know, the little telephone, the little window on the telephone that tells you who's calling, the caller ID. If it's the president, it just says POTUS, and if it's the vice president, it just says VPOTUS, and you know who it is. Not like it happened to me every minute, but and it didn't. But when it happened, it was memorable. V. POTUS called one day, and he said, "John, I got us into some trouble." And I said, "Oh?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "The president has to leave town, and I have to go to," it was one of these dinners, a White House correspondence, maybe, something like that. "I've got to go to the Washington Hilton and stand up for 10 minutes and be funny." And then he says, "I don't do funny." But as the record shows, I think he does do funny. Actually, he's got very good comic timing. He did very well in that setting, and in several other settings when he had to do that, when he was vice president. When you're in the speechwriting office, and this is true by and large of many other offices in the White House, you just have to be used to this great volume and variety of projects that will come your way, and you just need to remember that you shouldn't make a plan for your week. Or you can if you want to just amuse yourself on Monday afternoon. Just look at the plan you had made for the week ahead. It just never worked out that way. And I adopted a motto early. It was not original to me, but I've always liked it. And my motto was, where there is no alternative, there is no problem. You just do what you're asked to do when you have to do it. And if it's too much for you, you need to move on to another place of work. We usually had I'd say 4 to 10 days notice on speeches. That is, someone from the speechwriting office would go to something called the deputies meeting in the West Wing, and that's where you would get the basic guidance how the next couple of weeks are going to look for the president's schedule. So he's going to have this event, this presentation, this travel. And you also get some general guidance in advance about what the speech is going to be covering. And say, okay, well, that's going to be Social Security week. We've got to start getting some research on Social Security for that speech the week after next, or what have you. A State of the Union message, the big one every year to Congress. You have 3 or 4 weeks to work on that. In theory, you have a year to work on it because you know it's coming up. But in practice, you're not going to spend much. You're not going to start looking at that until very late in the year, because only then are you going to be certain about what priorities the president is going to want to talk about in that speech. And in our case, we would give him an outline, a heavy outline around Christmas time, and then he would react to that. And then in the first week of the year, when I was involved in the project, it would be my colleagues Mike and Matt and myself, and we would sit down for 7 days. It would usually take to do a first draft of the speech. Now, many other times you don't get much lead time at all. I mean, this is just in the nature of things. We lost our astronauts in February of 2003, and I think we had 3 or 4 hours, no more than that, to write a presidential speech. And the president was at Camp David and was coming down by motorcade because of bad weather. And that just gave us a little extra time to write, but a very short turnaround. The capture of Saddam Hussein, I remember, was a Sunday morning. The president spoke. Chief Justice Rehnquist died late midnight, Labor Day weekend, and I remember getting a call. We need a speech. The president's going to speak at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning from the Roosevelt Room. You just have to get ready for these things and be prepared. We had 2 former presidents, of course, die. Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford. State funerals were planned within just a few days, and you really had to up your game in those moments because there were very high-profile events. Now, the ultimate, of course, in the unexpected was September 11th, 2001, and as it happened, I had spent Monday, September 10th, with my colleague Matthew Scully working on a speech that the president was scheduled to deliver that Friday. And then at the end of Monday, the 10th, I looked at my calendar and I saw that the vice president had a speech on Friday as well that I hadn't done much thinking about, but that I was responsible for. So I called the vice president's assistant and asked if I could come in and see him first thing in the morning on September 11th. And she said, "How much time do you need?" And I said, "Oh, just a few minutes." And she said, "Well, sure, come in around 8:30. So I came in the next morning and the 11th, and it was a beautiful day. Very early, I came in about 6:30, and I had the president and vice president's schedules under the door when I got into the office, and I saw that I was the vice president's first appointment, and I didn't realize it was a formal appointment. So I remember being very mindful. Okay, I better be over there exactly 8:30. I got over there, and the deputy director of the budget office had dropped in on the vice president after the senior staff meeting, and so I just sort of held back. His door was open, but I could see he was talking to Mr. O'Keefe. And I just was there chatting with the two assistants who were at desks outside the vice president's office and the Secret Service man. There was always a Secret Service man standing post pretty nearby. And then, of course, at 8:46 is when the first plane hit the North Tower in New York. And either at that point someone told us to watch the TV or the TV was already on. I don't remember. But I remember we were sort of focusing on that. And a short time later, it was the Secret Service man who received word that it was a passenger jet that had hit the tower in New York. And I remember knowing that when the vice president's visitor left and the vice president motioned me to come into his office. And so at this point, it's close to 9 o'clock, I guess. And I said, "Sir, I just need to chat with you for a few minutes about the speech you have on Friday." And he said, sure, come on in, sit down. And so I sat down, and his television was on, and neither of us said anything. We just sat there looking at his television. And we were watching as the second plane appears and hits the South Tower. And of course, instantly you know that it's a coordinated attack, and events started moving very quickly. I remember within a few minutes, Condi Rice was in there, Josh Bolton, the deputy chief of staff, a fellow from the Situation Room came in, Mary Madeline, Scooter Libby, the vice president's chief of staff, came in. And I started to think, well, they're not going to be looking to me for advice in this situation. I don't possess any special insight in a moment like this, and I didn't know what to do. And so I did what any sensible man would do in the circumstances. I went to my office and called my mother. And my mother is in northern Wisconsin, and I called her and I said, "Mom." And she said, "Where are you?" And I just did my strong, manful reply, "Well, I'm in my office and everything's fine." And she said, "Well, I'm listening to the television, said the White House has been evacuated." And I remember kind of laughing. I said, "Well, I'm here." And knowing my passive personality, my mom says, "John, go out in the hallway and see if anyone else is there." And sure enough, I went out in the hallway, and this major evacuation was going on. And so I figured I should participate. And I remember I came out the door, and then we went down this hallway and then down these steps. And a Secret Service man I knew saw me and said, "John, everybody's got to get out of here." And I said, "I'm on my way." And then as the people started filing out this door, another Secret Service man said, "Everybody run, there's a plane coming at us." And I remember looking north of the White House, 16th Street, and seeing a plane in airspace where you never see planes in Washington. And I remember thinking that plane is going to destroy the White House, and it's filled with people, and they're all going to be killed. And I remember having this feeling of dread and this sense of disbelief that we are in the year 2001 and this is happening and the White House is being evacuated. This was not the plane that hit the White House. Incidentally, the Pentagon had already been hit by the time we were evacuated. So when I was with the Vice President, we saw what was happening in New York, but we didn't know there was a plane coming at us at 500 miles an hour. And during the evacuation I just described to you, what happened in the Vice President's office was that a Secret Service man ran in and told him, "Sir, we've got to get out of here." And the Vice President said, "Okay." And he said, "Now." And the Vice President wrote about this in his book. He was taken to the bunker somewhere underneath the 18 acres on the White House grounds, his feet barely touching the floor, as Secret Servicemen carried him by his belt and shoulders down to this secure place on the White House grounds. Well, my senior colleague Mike Gerson, was in his car. He didn't make it into the White House that day, but he saw the plane that hit the Pentagon. Saw it flying nearby. He saw it coming over Arlington Cemetery and remembers thinking, it's going to crash. And Matthew and I ended up on a speakerphone with Mike from an office building downtown. And we worked on a draft speech for the president that night, but our work is really not the speech that he gave. The speech that he gave that night, except for a few contributions we made, was really a Karen Hughes' speech, who was the president's top and most trusted communications advisor. The first big assignment we got and had to really deliver on was the memorial service on Friday at the National Cathedral for the president. And then the following Monday, Mike Gerson came in my office and said, "Well, the president's probably going to speak to Congress on Thursday." 3 days. And he wants a draft today. And I kind of laughed. I said, "Well, yeah, we can't do a presidential speech in 1 day, a speech to Congress in 1 day." He said, "Well, we have to." And I told the same thing to Karen. And I said, "Well, what did Karen say?" She said she told the same thing to the president. And the president wants, if he's going to speak to Congress 3 days from now, it's reasonable for him to want a draft today. So I remember we started working together. And Mike, our senior colleague, who, as always, had very good ideas and was kind of a policy intellectual, and had been in meetings talking about a lot of these things. He had some very good thoughts, and we sat down and we started putting the speech together. And it was around noontime, maybe 1 o'clock, that we were called into the Oval Office to see the president, and he wanted to know how the speech draft was coming. And one of us, I'm sure it was Mike, just told him, "Well, we're on it, and we've got a lot of things, a lot of thoughts together, and so forth." And the president said, "Well, Americans have questions. They want to know who attacked our country, and they want to know why they hate us, and they want to know how are we going to fight and win this war, and they want to know what is asked of us now." And if you remember, that's what the speech did. The speech went through a series of questions, and it was, in my recollection, the president himself who gave us that very, very good construct for the speech. And I remember we did have a draft ready for him that day. We didn't have a conclusion, but we did have a draft ready. But by Tuesday, it was all ready to go. And Karen Hughes, as always, helped us a great deal on that. And she had the great benefit of working with Karen was that when she liked something and knew the president would like it, she was never wrong. And so you always had this very good guidance from his most trusted advisor. President practiced that speech in the manner I described. Went to the movie theater in the East Wing, practiced it a few times, and I remember the day of the speech, Tony Blair came in, Prime Minister of the UK came in, and he met with the president, and the president did a speech practice, and then the president took a nap. And I remember being sort of impressed by the presence of mind of a man who was unquestionably going to be speaking to the largest audience in human history, but was able to relax and preserve his strength. And he made us very proud that night. And there was a lot of follow-on, as we all know, wars and tough decisions, but there was nothing quite like those early hours. And I remember the president telling us in those early hours and days, people are going to hear this again. They are going to hear this again. I'm going to say these things many times, and it's going to be my job to lead this country. And if people get tired of hearing it, was what I was taking from what he said. It didn't matter. It didn't matter if people got tired of hearing it. He was going to say it because it mattered. That speech, it was very successful, and it was, I think, an example from American history that will always stand of a man meaning his moment. And but if it wasn't a Churchillian speech, if you think about it, it wasn't high oratory. It was simple, and there was emotion, but there wasn't excess of emotion. There wasn't a straining to give meaning to events. The events had all the meaning that they needed, and all the moment required was plain and direct English. And I have thought many times about that when people ask me about speech writing generally. What is the key to a perfect speech? And I heard somebody say once, "Oh, there's 3 keys to a perfect speech." 3, only 3. The problem is nobody knows what they are. But a great speech is going to be a speech that is perfectly timed. I mean, that is important. That every great speech in history was perfectly timed, I maintain. It's also important to remember that we live in a conversational age. It's not an oratorical age. If you started speaking in 19th century oratory or early 20th century oratory, people really wouldn't respond to it. It's also important to remember that you're writing for the ear. It's very important to remember that when you're a speechwriter. No matter how many times you've looked at something you've been working on, no matter how many times you've refined it, how many fixes you've made, how many little problems you have repaired, and so on, it's still important to read it aloud. And I remember having the experience once with a colleague. We were reading aloud a speech we'd written, and we were very excited because we were getting to our favorite part of the speech. And when we got to that part and read it aloud, we discovered that it rhymed, so it had to go. But we never caught that until we read it aloud, and so it's one of the things we always had to do. We were pretty light on adjectives. We didn't use a lot of adjectives. We really fought hard not to use cliches, skyrocketing health insurance premiums or something like that. It is something that, if you Google it, will come up 8 zillion times. It's probably not a good phrase to use in a speech. So we always looked for things like that. Now, working for President Bush, I knew that it was a good idea. It made a lot of sense as a speechwriter to use 2 sentences instead of 3 sentences, if that's going to make the point, and use 2 words instead of 3 words, and use 2 syllables instead of 3 syllables, just to keep it simple. And you don't need to use big fancy words. And you don't need to use compound construction. You just don't need to use it. And I remember Ted Sorensen, who I got to know, who worked for President Kennedy. He said, President Kennedy always told me use 2 syllables instead of 3 syllables, and use 2 words instead of 3 words. Keep it very simple. So it's kind of like rules that you kind of settle on in your own mind, and you settle on them because they work. Well, they didn't just work for you. They worked for others in the past. And I remember Sorensen had a number of things that he said he had learned working for President Kennedy that were directly applicable to my own experience. Sorensen used to say that a good speech should have 4 things: charity, clarity, levity, and brevity. Now, levity, everyone knows what that means. Brevity, God knows, everybody wants brevity. Clarity? Well, clarity is simply, what was she talking about? What was he talking about? Was the speech organized? Was it logical? Did it have transitions that made sense? Did it have words that called, odd attention to themselves? just to, sometimes you don't know how a speech is going to come together until you really start working on it and see how it writes. Sometimes it's better to start out with the problem and then the solution. Other times it's better to just go back and forth. A little bit of the problem, a little bit of the solution, a little bit of the problem, a little bit of the solution. There's no formula, and I think it's good to remember that one shouldn't be formulaic in writing speeches. Otherwise, if you give a lot of them, they're going to start to have a sameness and a predictability to them. And then charity. I think that speaks to tone. You're always thinking about, in speech writing, who's my audience? Who is this for? Is this an audience of the president's deepest, strongest, longest standing supporters? Or is this an audience he's never spoken to before and one he really wants to make an impression on? You're gonna have a different quality of speech when you from one audience to another. And what's the purpose? Is it to persuade? Are we here to move? Are we here to educate? Are we here to inspire? You have to think about those things. Feeling is important, and it's a bias of mine, I think. It's always best to convey feeling instead of declaring feeling. In other words, if I were to stand here and say, I believe with every fiber of my being, which is a phrase you hear a lot in politics, that, thus and so, I don't expect that to persuade anyone in this room. I've only met a few of you, and all for the first time, except for one or two. You're not going to be impressed by how deeply I feel about something. You're going to be impressed if I can make you feel deeply about it. And just declaring my own feeling is just not enough. You need to be persuasive and make your point to an audience that may not feel one way or the other about it, or may feel strongly the other way. Make it interesting, but how? The best advice I got about speech writing came from someone who isn't really a speechwriter and wasn't talking about speech writing, but it was spot on. It was one of my favorite historians, David McCullough. And he's written books about Harry Truman, Theodore Roosevelt, the Brooklyn Bridge, the Johnstown flood, Americans in Paris, and a couple others. And John Adams, the big bestseller. And Truman, probably the biggest. And somebody asked him, it was Brian Lamb probably, how do you decide what your next book is going to be? It's not, one can't predict from looking at all these what your next book is going to be. How are you going to decide? And McCullough said, I write the book I want to read. And this is how he decided to write about the Brooklyn Bridge. He went looking for a good book on the Brooklyn Bridge, couldn't find one. So, well, I'm going to have to write it. And that I took to heart right away when I heard it. If I'm writing a speech, yes, I want it to be something that I wouldn't mind listening to, something that if it were just a first encounter for me, that I would follow along and I would enjoy listening to it and feel that it was not a waste of my time in any sense, and I was getting something useful out of it. And so I keep that in mind every time I'm asked to write something. It's not a performance, but it's just something that you want the reader to be proud to give and the listener to find entertaining. As I mentioned before, the most important thing is to write for somebody you like. And also, when you're in politics, as I have been fortunate to be, remember that it's not about you. It's not about you. It's you're the person behind the scenes, and you're privileged to be a small part of something big, something that was here a long time before you came along, and will be here a long time after you've moved on. I'll tell you a story about the first week I was on the White House staff, and I was in a kind of a reception area, and the deputy chief of staff, I remember, was standing there, and we were chatting, and the receptionist answered the telephone and put it on hold and calls over to me. So, John, it's Timothy Ward from the Washington Post, wants to speak with you. I thought, wow, I've been on the White House staff less than a week, and I'm getting a call from the Washington Post. then I thought, well, Washington, word gets around, and I guess they know I'm here. I guess I better take this call. The deputy chief of staff is standing there and a couple other younger staffers, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to take this call. I'm going to let them see how I handle the media. And so I picked up the phone and said, yes, is this Mr. McConnell? Yes, Timothy Ward from the Washington Post. Thanks for taking the call. I just have a question for you, sir. I said, sure. Well, how can I help you? He said, well, we know you just started there, and we're wondering if you'd be interested in a subscription. You've been a very nice audience. Thank you very much.
Ask a question in a little bit different vein. When did John Bolton get all that hair, and what does it mean to him?
I don't know. You're talking about the United Nations ambassador.
Yes, that one. Because he wasn't like that in college.
Is that, did you know him in college?
Yes.
You're a Yale guy?
Yeah.
I'll be darned. I don't know the answer to that.
He was a very ordinary-looking, short-haired,
Is that right?
conservative guy with a calm demeanor.
Yeah. I wish I could shed some light on that for you. He's a fine guy, though, I tell you. Brilliant guy. Great to be around.
Thank you, Mr. McConnell, for being here tonight. So if you could write a speech, this is a big one, okay? If you could write a speech for any public figure throughout history, who would you choose?
Wow, Ronald Reagan, John Kennedy, Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, right off the top of my head, those voices. Reagan, Kennedy, Roosevelt. I mean, Reagan with his background, they talk about his background in acting, which is important, was just as important, if not more important, that he was first a broadcaster and announcer. When Ronald Reagan would give a speech, he never moved a muscle below his neck. He didn't gesture, he didn't shift his weight, he didn't move. He just moved his head. And he said he always treated the microphone like it was a human ear. Don't speak any louder or softer than you would if that was someone's ear. And he just had all these. I heard a story. Well, Reagan told the story, not to me, but he said that he was giving a speech one night on a platform in California, and Frank Sinatra was there. And Sinatra came up to Mrs. Reagan and said, Nancy, Ron was drinking ice water up there tonight. And that's a bad idea. And she said, oh? And Sinatra said, yeah. He said, you've got to drink lukewarm water. He said, that's what I do when I'm singing, and I've got a glass of water. And he said, ice water makes your vocal cords tighter and your voice higher. He said, so tell him that. And so from then on, Reagan had lukewarm water and loved to tell the story to people. He was the master. It would have been wonderful to write for him. John Kennedy, he had a great synergy with Ted Sorensen. He called him his intellectual blood bank, and they would sit down and turn out this material together, like the inaugural address. And Franklin Roosevelt, God, there's a story. There was an old butler at the White House named Alonzo Fields. He was there for a long, long time. Alonzo Fields was in the White House on December 7th, 1941. And he was serving coffee in the yellow oval room in the family quarters upstairs. And he heard Roosevelt being told, I don't know who it was, Stimson or somebody. He said that this person meeting with Roosevelt said, Mr. President, the whole damn Navy's gone. And that's how the news came to the president that we were at war with the Japanese Empire, and he was going to have to speak to Congress the next day. We had an army smaller than the army of Sweden. Congress had just decided by one vote to keep the military, the draft, one vote. We were and it wasn't at all clear to anybody that the United States was going to win a war like this. And this guy had to rally the country. And that speech he gave to Congress the next day is just one of the great utterances in the history of the English language. There's no question about it. And it's short. It is a really short speech. and it is filled with terrible news. I regret very much to tell you, you know, and then he just goes through some of the terrible things that have happened. And he and then rallied the country, you know, about winning through to absolute victory. The American people in their righteous might. I mean, really great and so consequential. And for a country that really, I mean, the Navy was gone, except for the carriers. The Pacific Fleet was at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. And I don't know, I marvel at it. He had several speechwriters, Bob Sherwood, Sam Rosenman, and there was a third, well, Harry Hopkins, I guess, helped a lot on those speeches. And they used to work in the cabinet room. The speechwriters would spread out on the big cabinet table and work in there, and then the White House chef would cook for them. This never happened in my day. Speechwriters had a much better deal back then. Anyway, that was easy call. Lincoln, I wouldn't have tried.
I was in high school during the Kennedy era, and unfortunately a freshman in college in November of '63. But I got to see the inauguration January 20th, 1961, because we had a snow day down in Quincy, Mass. But I think of all the presidents, and I do watch a lot of political shows, I think JFK, and if you see some of the old tapes, the way he handled the press.
Yeah.
He was way above the press. He was very comfortable because he knew all the answers. He was, I mean, you just felt that he was not the way they are today. They only take certain questions, and you know, and they have limits on this and that. But I thought, if you look at some of the old tapes of Kennedy, the way he handled the press, I thought that was great.
Yeah. There's a book just came out called Listening In, and it came out in the last couple of months, and it's for the first time, the Kennedy Library has released a bunch of the recordings that were made in the Oval Office. Arthur Schlesinger told a story when, during Watergate, Schlesinger had been an advisor to President Kennedy in the White House for several years. He said when it came out during the Watergate scandal that Nixon had been secretly recording conversations in the Oval Office, Schlesinger went on national TV and said, John Kennedy would never have even considered doing something like this. Somebody from the Kennedy Library called him right away and said, you better back off on that in a hurry. Kennedy's got tons of these. And Kennedy had a secret recording system in the Oval Office. Anyway, they've released a bunch of the tapes. And these are very interesting to listen to. When he chews out the guy from the Air Force about letting cameras in to take pictures of Mrs. Kennedy's hospital room when she was going to have the baby, you know, lets this guy have it. You know, it's he uses what David Brinkley would call fragrant language.
Hello, and thank you for being here again tonight. I was just going to say, as a politics major, and like all the other politics majors in the room, we're all kind of addicts to the West Wing.
Oh, okay.
So naturally, you being kind of like a real-life Toby Ziegler character, is the show accurate at all in terms of life in the White House? And I guess it's just a general overarching question. You know, what was kind of like the most stressful thing about White House life, and what was the most rewarding thing about White House life?
The show, I didn't see much of it. I just saw snippets here and there, and it never seemed accurate to me. They were always walking in circles. They were always walking around. And always there was this sharp repartee, and it just wasn't that way. It was Hollywood's image, and it didn't really ring true for me. I mean, it wasn't completely off base, but it's not quite the place it's portrayed to be. The most stressful, you know, you have to be ready for anything, but you're ready. I mean, that's part of the job description. You know, if someone ever says to you, I work at the White House, they called me in 3 Saturdays in a row. I mean, that is not something to complain about. That is literally in the job description, I think. It should be, and so don't worry about that. I guess the stress, just always wanting more time to work on things. There was always concern about that. And the most rewarding thing was working for a president and vice president that I liked so much, and feeling like I was making a contribution. You also, I never served in the military, and it's really the only time in my life I've spent a lot of time around military people. The White House military office and all the operations, the movements, and then of course the heroes who come through the White House, and those are the events that really stick with you too. The events, when the Medal of Honor is presented to a person who actually performed above and beyond the call of duty. I mean, did something that no one could have ordered him to do, and no one could have criticized him for not doing. And it's even more touching when he's not there to receive it, as his mom is receiving it. Inspiring and humbling, memorable moments. Thank you.
On behalf of the Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, thank you very much for coming.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.